I heard someone say that in the midst of all this social distancing, that it's more important than ever to make sure that we are being spiritually connected, that we're not being spiritually distanced from one another or from God. And so I thank you for joining me again this week. It's odd and strange for me to be doing these virtual services and sermons or reflections, whatever we might want to call them. But I do thank you for joining me again this week. The passage for this week comes from Romans. It's starting there at chapter 8, verse 6. To set the mind on the flesh is death, but to set the mind on the Spirit is life and peace. For this reason, the mind that is set on the flesh is hostile to God. It does not submit to God's law. Indeed, it cannot. And those who are in the flesh cannot please God. But you are not in the flesh, you are in the Spirit, since the Spirit of God dwells in you. Anyone who does not have the Spirit of Christ does not belong to him. But if Christ is in you, though the body is dead because of sin, the Spirit is life because of righteousness. If the Spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead dwells in you, he who raised Christ from the dead will give life to your mortal bodies also through his Spirit that dwells in you. This is the word of God for us, the people of God. Thanks be to God. I remember when I was growing up that my parents would often use an expression or a phrase, one that I'm sure you've heard before, or something like it. Something like, you can do anything you set your mind to. Now, they were doing the right thing. They were encouraging me. They were building my confidence. Not unlike how I have even done that with my 3-year-old daughter. When she's getting frustrated because she can't zip up a jacket or something, I'll tell her, you can do it. I know you can do it. Just settle down, be patient, let's focus. You can do it. Of course, setting our minds to do something, or setting our minds has a lot to do with being determined, of seeing something through. And the older we get, we learn to pepper our gung-ho attitudes with, I guess, some realistic expectation. I mean, we know not everybody's going to be a professional sports player. Not everybody's going to go to med school. And not everybody's going to build their own business. It's a nice sentiment, a nice thought, maybe particularly to instill in young people to help build confidence and to encourage them. But we also know the truth that we can't do everything we set our minds to. We just can't. And it's a helpful thing to remember as we get into the passage today, when Paul is talking about flesh and spirit. Now, what are these words? What is he talking about here? Well, he's not talking about two components within ourselves. He's not talking about that, because this isn't just about us. We remember that what he's ultimately talking about here are conflicting powers that sort of compete, not just for our attention, but for our influence, powers, sovereignties that seek to control our bodies and direct our movements and our thoughts. And those are the flesh and the spirit. The flesh, or one person has called the ego, which I think is maybe a more helpful way of thinking about it, or basically anything minus God. That's flesh. And then the spirit, well, that's God. That's the power of God. And to set our minds on one of them, either flesh or spirit, so to set our minds in this context is not about accomplishing something through our own human ability, like zipping up a jacket or going to med school or whatever the case may be. Now, to set our minds in this context is still about determination, but it is about being determined to follow a particular way. Is it the kind of thing where we're determined to follow our own way? Or are we determined to follow God's way? Are we determined to move toward the vision of the world that we long for? Or are we determined to follow in the way that, or to seek the vision of the way God sees things, the way God is moving and working in the world? You know, throughout Christian history, Paul's words here have been misinterpreted in some cases, and has led to some pretty poor theology. I think the church knows now that the material world is not evil. Of course, this was something that the church wrestled with, different heresies and things that crept in. The material world is not evil. The body is not evil. But if we're not careful, that's one way that we can read this passage, that the body is evil, that what God has created and called good is evil. Well, we know that's not true, and in fact has led to some pretty bad things. One is the demonization of sex. Another, in history, we see how slaveholders would sometimes use these words from Paul as ammunition to convince their slaves that, well, their bodies don't really matter anyway, because it's ultimately about the spirit. So we must remember that Paul's he's not hating on the body here. He's not hating on creation or the material world. Instead, Paul's saying that to set your mind on the flesh is to be determined to follow a way that is not God's way, and that is a way that leads to death. But setting your mind on the Spirit, following God's way, is a way that leads to life and a way that leads to peace. God's Spirit is always doing that. God's Spirit is always bringing life out of death and peace out of fear. We remember that passage, gospel passage, when Jesus brought back to life Lazarus, when he called him out of the grave, or he said, unbind him. We recall that story, but we also recall in our own lives ways in which we have been unbound, or ways in which God has called us out of our graves, called us out of our deadness. Over the past few weeks, because of this coronavirus, I have never seen 2 Timothy quoted so much in all my life. You might have seen it, or you might have quoted it yourselves. God has not given us a spirit of what? Fear. That's right. I'm sure he's just said it or thought it. God has not given us a spirit of fear. We've seen that so many times. But how does that verse continue? What comes next? It says, God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and love and of a sound mind. Now, of course, just like you, I've witnessed in these past few weeks fear. I've had some myself. I've seen people buying more bread and more chicken and more eggs and more toilet paper than I don't think could ever be used in a lifetime. So I've seen that scarcity mindset. I've seen some things that, some pretty fleshly things during this time. But like you know what I've also seen? I've also witnessed power. I've witnessed love. I've witnessed people whose minds are set on the Spirit. I witness people who are determined to follow God's way, determined to live into the vision that God has for His creation. Some of you, I know, are calling brothers and sisters and friends and family like you never have before. I'm working with one of you right now to build some stands that will hold hand sanitizers for both churches. Many of you are helping one another with chores and getting out and doing things for people that are uncomfortable getting out right now. Many of you are still helping with our food ministries or helping people on your own with food. Many of you are still giving to the church and to individuals, to one another. I know this is true because Well, I've been the recipient of this in some cases. Just the other day, someone came over to the house, over to the parsonage, and gave us a Dollar General gift card. Now, of course, we don't need a gift card, but I'll tell you what we do need, and it's the same thing you need, is the love of Christ. And that is exactly what was revealed through that simple act of giving that gift card. And that is the same power, that is the same love that God is doing and using through the church right now in these uncertain times. He's using people like you. He's using people like me. He's using people whose minds are set on the Spirit. Amen.